Chapter 1. On the first Monday of April 1625, the market town of Mung, birthplace of the author of the Roman de la Rose, seemed to be in as great a turmoil as if the Huguenots had come to turn it into a second La Rochelle. The number of townsmen, seeing women running in the direction of the main street and hearing children shouting on doorsteps, hastened to put on their breastplates and, steadying their rather uncertain self-assurance with a musket or a halberd, made their way toward the inn, the Hôtelier du Franc, Monsieur, in front of which a noisy, dense, and curious throng was growing larger by the minute. Panics were frequent in those times. A few days went by when an event of this kind was not recorded in the archives of one town or another. Noblemen fought among themselves. The king was at war with the cardinal, the Spanish were at war with the king, and then, besides all this secret or open warfare, there were robbers, beggars, Huguenots, wolves, and lackeys who were at war with everyone. The townsmen always took up arms against robbers, wolves, and lackeys, often against noblemen and Huguenots, sometimes against the king, but never against the cardinal or the Spanish. It was because of these habits that the townsmen on the first Monday of April 1625, hearing a commotion and seeing neither a red nor yellow Spanish flag nor the livery of the Cardinal Richelieu, hurried toward the Franc-Meunier Inn. When they arrived there, they were able to see the cause of the tumult. A young man. Let us sketch a rapid portrait of him. Imagine a Don Quixote at 18, a Don Quixote without chainmail or thigh pieces, wearing a woolen doublet whose original blue had been transformed into an elusive shade between purple and azure. He had a long, dark face with prominent cheekbones, a mark of shrewdness. His jaw muscles were heavily developed, an infallible sign by which one can recognize a Gascon, even without a beret, or a young man. And our young man wore a beret adorned with some sort of feather. His eyes were frank and intelligent. His nose was hooked but finely drawn. He was too big for an adolescent and too small for a full-grown man. An untrained eye might have taken him for a farmer's son on a journey if it had not been for the sword that hung from a shoulder belt slapping against his calves when he walked and against his shaggy horse when he rode. For the young man had a mount, one that could not fail to attract attention. A small burn horse, 12 to 14 years old, with a yellowish coat, an almost hairless tail, and sores on his legs. He walked with his head lower than his knees, which made a martingale unnecessary, but he could still do 20 miles a day. Unfortunately, his good qualities were hidden by his strange color and his outlandish gait, which had come into Mung a quarter of an hour earlier through the Bougainville gate, and since in those days everyone was a practiced judge of horses, his appearance had caused a sensation that cast disfavor on his rider. This was all the more painful to young D'Artagnan, such was the name of the Don Quixote astride the other Renseant, because he was well aware of how ridiculous his horse made him seem, even though he was an excellent rider. That was why he had sighed when he had accepted the horse as a gift from his father. He knew that such an animal was worth at least 20 livres, and the words that had accompanied the gift, however, were priceless. "My son," the Gascon nobleman had said in the Bern accent that Henry IV never succeeded in losing. "This horse was born on my estate nearly 13 years ago and has never left it. That should be enough to make you love him. Never sell him. Let him die peacefully and honorably of old age, and if you go to war with him, treat him with the consideration as you would treat an old servant. At court, if you have the honor to go there, an honor to which your ancient nobility entitles you, be worthy of your noble name, worthily borne by your ancestors for over 500 years. You, yourself, your relatives, and your friends never tolerate the slightest affront from anyone except the cardinal or the king. Remember this. It's by courage and courage alone that a nobleman makes his way nowadays. Anyone who trembles for even 1 second may lose the chance that fortune offered him precisely at that second. You're young and you must be brave for 2 reasons. First, you're a Gascon, and second, you're my son. Don't be afraid of opportunities and seek out adventures. I've taught you to use a sword. You have iron legs and a steel wrist. Fight duels at the drop of a hat, especially since duels are forbidden. That means it takes twice as much courage to fight one. My son, all I have to give you is 15 écus, my horse, and my advice you've just heard. Your mother will give you the recipe for an ointment that a gypsy woman taught her how to make. It miraculously heals any wound that doesn't reach the heart. Make the most of all these gifts and have a long, happy life. I have only one more thing to add, an example for you to follow. It's not my own because I never appeared at court, and I've only fought in the wars of religion as a volunteer. I'm speaking of Monsieur de Treville, who used to be my neighbor and had the honor of playing with our King Louis XIII, may God preserve him, when they were both children. Sometimes their games turned into fights, and the king didn't always win them. The drubbings he got from Monsieur de Treville made him feel great respect and friendship for him. Later, Monsieur de Treville fought duels, 5 on his way to Paris, 7 between the time when the late king died and the young one became of age, not to mention wars and sieges. And by now he may have fought 100. So in spite of edicts, orders, and decrees, he's now captain of the Musketeers. The Musketeers, my son, are a legion of heroes highly favored by the king and feared by the cardinal, who fears very little, as everyone knows. Furthermore, Monsieur de Treville earns 10,000 écus a year, so he's a very great lord. He began like you. Go to see him with this letter and take him as your model. The elder D'Artagnan then buckled his own sword on his son, kissed him on both cheeks, and gave him his blessing. When he left his father's room, the young man found his mother waiting for him with the famous recipe, which he could expect to use rather often if he followed the advice he had just been given. This time the farewells were longer and more tender. Not that Monsieur D'Artagnan did not love his son, who was his only child, but he was a man, and he considered it unworthy of a man to let himself be carried away by emotion, whereas Madame D'Artagnan was not only a woman but also a mother. She wept abundantly, and to her son's credit, his feelings went out despite his efforts to hold them in check as he thought a future musketeer should do. He shed many tears and was able to hide only half of them. He left that same day, taking his father's 3 gifts, the 15 écus, the horse, and the letter from Monsieur de Treville, with the advice thrown into the bargain. Traveling with that horse and that advice, he was the exact copy, morally and physically, of Cervantes' hero, with whom we so accurately compared him when our duty as a historian required us to describe him. Don Quixote took windmills for giants and sheep for armies. D'Artagnan took every smile as an insult and every look as a challenge. As a result, all the way from Tarbes to Meung, his fist was constantly clenched, and he put his hand to the pommel of his sword a dozen times. His fist never struck a jaw, however, and his sword never left its sheath. Not that the sight of his awkward yellow horse did not bring smiles to many faces, but since above the horse there was a sword in a respectable size, and above the sword a pair of eyes that were fierce rather than proud, the passer-by repressed their laughter, or, if amusement proved to be stronger than prudence, they at least tried to laugh only to one side, like ancient masks. D'Artagnan therefore remained majestic, and his sensitivity remained untouched, till he reached the town of Meung. But there, as he was getting off his horse in front of the Franc Meunier Inn, there was no one, neither the innkeeper, the waiter, nor the stableman, come to hold his stirrup in the mounting block. He glanced at a half-open window on the ground floor and saw a tall, handsome, and rather grim-looking nobleman talking with 2 people who seemed to listen to him with deference. As usual, D'Artagnan assumed that he was the subject of their conversation, and listened to it. This time he was not completely mistaken. He was not being discussed, but his horse was. The nobleman seemed to be describing the animal's qualities, and because his listeners showed great deference to him, as we have mentioned, they burst out laughing every few moments. Since a faint smile was enough to stir up D'Artagnan's irascibility, it is easy to imagine the effect produced on him by this loud laughter. But first he wanted to have a closer look at the insolent stranger who was mocking him. He saw that he was a man in his early 40s with dark, piercing eyes, a pale complexion, and a prominent nose, and a neatly trimmed black mustache. He wore a purple doublet and breeches and laces of the same color, with no other ornament than the usual slashes through which his shirt appeared. His doublet and breeches, though new, were wrinkled as if they had been taken out of a trunk. D'Artagnan noticed all this with the quickness of a careful observer, and no doubt also with the instinctive feeling that this man was going to have a great influence on his life. While D'Artagnan was examining him, he made a particularly profound remark about the yellow horse. His 2 listeners laughed again, and contrary to his habit, he let a faint smile appear on his face. This time there could be no doubt. D'Artagnan had really been insulted. Filled with this conviction, he pulled his beret down over his forehead, and trying to copy some of the court manners he had observed in lords traveling through Gascony, he walked forward with one hand on the guard of his sword and the other on his hip. Unfortunately, however, he was so carried away by anger that instead of the haughty, dignified speech in which he intended to formulate his challenge, these blunt words were the only ones that came to his tongue, accompanied by a furious gesture. "You there, hiding behind the shutter. Yes, you. Tell me what you are laughing at so we can laugh together." The stranger slowly moved his eyes from the horse to its rider, as though it took him a certain time to realize that this odd reproach was being addressed to him. Then, when there could be no longer any uncertainty, he frowned slightly and, after a rather long pause, replied to D'Artagnan in a tone of irony and insolence impossible to describe. "I'm not speaking to you, sir." "But I'm speaking to you," cried D'Artagnan, exasperated at that mixture of elegance and disdain. The stranger looked at him with his faint smile for a few moments longer, then left the window, slowly walked out of the inn, passed within 2 paces of D'Artagnan, and stopped in front of his horse. His calm self-assurance and mocking expression had redoubled the amusement of his companions, who remained at the window. Seeing him approach, D'Artagnan had drawn his sword a foot out of its sheath. "The horse is, or rather was in its youth, the color of a buttercup," said the stranger, continuing his examination, addressing his 2 listeners at the window, seemingly unaware of D'Artagnan's exasperation, even though the young man was standing in front of the window. "It's a color that's quite common in plants, but very rare in horses." "You laugh at a horse because you're afraid to laugh at its master," D'Artagnan said with a reckless fury worthy of his model, Monsieur de Treville. "I don't laugh often, sir, as you can see from my face, but I intend to keep the privilege of laughing when it suits me, and I don't want anyone to laugh when it doesn't suit me." "Really, sir," said the stranger, calmer than ever. "Well, that seems fair enough." He turned away and prepared to walk back to the inn through the front door, beside which D'Artagnan, when he arrived, had noticed a saddled horse. But it was not in D'Artagnan's nature to abandon a man who had insolently made fun of him. He drew his sword completely and ran after him, shouting, "You've mocked me for the last time, sir. Turn and face me, so I won't have to run you through from behind." "Run me through," said the stranger, turning around and looking at him with such astonishment and contempt. "Come, come, my friend, you must be mad." Then, in an undertone, as though talking to himself, "What a pity when His Majesty is always looking for brave men to join his musketeers." No sooner had he said this than D'Artagnan lunged at him so fiercely that his mocking would have indeed been ended forever if he had not quickly stepped back. Seeing it was no longer a laughing matter, he drew his sword, saluted his opponent, and gravely stood on guard. But just then his 2 companions, accompanied by the innkeeper, attacked D'Artagnan with a stick, a shovel, and a pair of tongs. This was such a sudden and thorough diversion that while D'Artagnan turned to defend himself against the rain of blows, the stranger sheathed his sword and began watching the battle with his usual impassivity. "A plague on these Gascons," he said. "Put him back on his orange horse and send him away." "Not till I've killed you, you coward," cried D'Artagnan, holding firm against his 3 attackers and warding off their blows as best as he could. "More blustering, I swear. These Gascons are incorrigible. Keep him dancing since he insists on it. He'll tell you when he's had enough." But the stranger did not yet know what kind of man he was dealing with. D'Artagnan was too stubborn ever to ask for mercy. The fight continued a few more seconds. Then D'Artagnan, exhausted, dropped his sword, which one of his assailants broke with a stick. Almost at the same moment, a blow to the forehead knocked him to the ground, bleeding and half unconscious. That was when people came running to the scene from all directions. Fearing a scandal, the innkeeper had his servants help him carry D'Artagnan to the kitchen, where the wounds were given perfunctory treatment. As for the stranger, he went back inside and took up his place at the window. He watched the crowd impatiently, as though its continued presence had caused him great annoyance. Hearing the door open behind him, he looked around and saw the innkeeper. "Well, how's the young hothead?" "Are you safe and sound, Your Excellency?" asked the innkeeper. "Yes, I'm perfectly safe and sound, but you haven't answered the question. What's become of our Gascon?" "He's doing better," replied the innkeeper. "He's completely unconscious now." "Really?" "Yes, but before he fainted, he gathered enough strength to call for you and challenge you." "He must be the devil in person," exclaimed the stranger. "Oh, no, Your Excellency, he's not the devil," the innkeeper said with a contemptuous grimace, "because we searched him after he fainted and found that he had only 1 shirt in his bag and only 12 écus in his purse. Even so, while he was still conscious, he said that if such a thing had happened in Paris, you'd have regretted it immediately, but since it happened here, you won't regret it until later." "In that case," said the stranger remarkably imperturbably, "he must be some prince of the blood in disguise. I'm telling you this, sir, Your Excellency, so that you can be on your guard." "Did he mention anyone's name in his anger?" "Yes, he patted his pocket and said, 'We'll see what Monsieur de Treville thinks about an insult to a man who's under his protection.'" "Monsieur de Treville?" the stranger suddenly attentive. "He patted his pocket and mentioned Monsieur de Treville's name. After he fainted, I'm sure you didn't neglect to look into the pocket, did you?" asked the stranger. "A letter addressed to Monsieur de Treville, captain of the Musketeers." "Are you sure?" "Quite sure, Your Excellency." The innkeeper, who is not gifted with great perspicacity, had not noticed the effect produced by his words. The stranger left the window where he had remained with his elbow resting on the sill and murmured with a worried frown, "Can it be that Tréville sent a Gascon after me? He's very young, but a sword thrust is a sword thrust, no matter who gives it, and a boy like that would be less likely to arouse my suspicion. Sometimes a small obstacle is enough to upset a great plan." He was lost in thought for several minutes. Finally, he said to the innkeeper, "I'd like you to put that lunatic out of the way from me. My conscience wouldn't let me kill him, and yet," he added with a coldly menacing expression, "he's a hindrance to me. Where is he?" "In my wife's room on the second floor. His wounds are being dressed." "Are his clothes in his bag with him? Is he still wearing his doublet?" "No, all those things are downstairs in the kitchen. But since he's a bother to you, sir—" "Yes, he is, and he's causing a disturbance in your inn that decent people can't overlook. Go up to your room, make out my bill, and tell my servant to get ready to leave." "What? You're leaving us already, Your Excellency?" "You know I am, since I ordered you to have my horse saddled. Hasn't it been done?" "Yes, sir. As you can see for yourself, your horse is saddled and waiting by the door." "Very well. Now do as I told you." The innkeeper nodded and thought, "Can he be afraid of that boy?" But a stern look from the stranger put an end to his reflections, and he bowed humbly and walked out. "That young rascal mustn't see my lady," the stranger said to himself. "She'll be here soon. She's already late. I'd better ride out to meet her. If only I knew what's in that letter to Tréville." And still muttering to himself, he headed for the kitchen. Meanwhile, the innkeeper, convinced that the stranger was leaving his inn because of the boy's presence, went to his wife's room and saw that D'Artagnan had finally regained consciousness. Telling him that the police would be sure to arrest him for having picked a quarrel with a great lord, for in his opinion the stranger could only be a great lord, he persuaded him to get up and continue on his way despite his weakness. D'Artagnan, still half dazed, with his doublet and with his head swathed in bandages, stood up and, pushed by the innkeeper, went downstairs. But when he reached the kitchen, the first thing he saw was the stranger standing beside a heavy carriage with 2 big Norman horses hitched to it, calmly talking to a woman inside. The woman, whose face was framed by the carriage window, was between 20 and 22 years old. Being a quick observer, as we have already mentioned, D'Artagnan saw at a glance that she was young and beautiful. He was all the more struck by her beauty because it was foreign to the southern regions where he had always lived. She was pale and blonde, with long curly hair that hung down over her shoulders, big, languid blue eyes, pink lips, and hands as white as alabaster. She was talking animatedly with the stranger. "So His Eminence has ordered me to go back to England without delay," said the stranger, "and notify him immediately if the Duke leaves London." "And what are my other instructions?" asked the beautiful traveler. "They're in this box. You're not to open it till you've crossed the Channel." "Very well. And what are you doing?" "I'm going back to Paris." Without punishing that insolent boy?" Just as the stranger opened his mouth to reply, D'Artagnan, who had heard everything, appeared in the doorway of the inn. "This insolent boy will punish you," he cried, "unless you escape from me again as you did before." "Escape from you?" said the stranger, frowning. "I don't think you'll dare to run away in front of a lady." "No," exclaimed Milady, seeing the stranger put his hand to his sword. "Remember that the slightest delay can be disastrous." "You're right," he conceded. "It's time for us to go on our separate ways." He took leave of her with a nod and leapt onto his horse, while the driver of the carriage vigorously cracked his whip. He and Milady both left at a gallop in opposite directions. "What about your bill?" shouted the innkeeper, whose affection for his guest had turned to disdain when he saw that he was leaving without settling his account. "Pay it," said the stranger, calling back to his servant, who tossed a few coins at the innkeeper's feet and rode away after his master. "Coward! Miserable coward! False nobleman!" cried D'Artagnan, rushing off in pursuit. But he was still too weak for such an effort. He had taken no more than 10 steps and there was a ringing in his ears. He felt dizzy, and a cloud of blood passed before his eyes. He fell in the middle of the street, still shouting, "Coward! Coward! Coward!" The innkeeper went over to him. "He's really a coward," he said, trying to put himself on good terms with D'Artagnan, as the hero of La Fontaine's fable became reconciled to eating a snail at the end of the day. "Yes, he's very cowardly," murmured D'Artagnan, "but she's very beautiful." "Who's very beautiful?" asked the innkeeper. "Milady," D'Artagnan answered feebly, and fainted again. "I've lost 2 guests," thought the innkeeper, "but I still have this one, and I'm sure I can keep him several days. At least I'll have taken 11 écus. 11 écus was exactly the sum that remained in D'Artagnan's purse. The innkeeper was counting on 11 days' convalescence at 1 écu a day, but he had reckoned without his guest. At 5 o'clock the next morning, D'Artagnan got up, went to the kitchen, and among several other ingredients that history has not revealed to us, asked for some wine, olive oil, and rosemary. Then, following his mother's recipe, he made an ointment which he put on his many wounds. He changed the compresses himself and would not allow a doctor to be called in. Thanks to the efficacy of the gypsy ointment, and also perhaps to the absence of a doctor, by that evening he was back on his feet, and by the next day he had almost completely healed. But when he reached into his pocket to pay for the rosemary, olive oil, wine, and the other ingredients, the only expense he had incurred for himself, since he was strictly fasted, although his yellow horse, at least according to the innkeeper, had eaten 3 times as much as he could have reasonably supposed for an animal that size, D'Artagnan found only his threadbare little velvet purse, and the 11 écus it contained. The letter to Monsieur Tréville had disappeared. He began looking for it impatiently, turning all his pockets inside out, rummaging in his bag, opening and closing his purse. But when he finally became convinced that the letter was really gone, he flew into another rage that nearly added more ointment and ingredients to his bill. For, seeing him lose his temper and hearing him threaten to smash everything in the inn if his letter was not found, the innkeeper picked up a pike, his wife brandished a broomstick, and the servants armed themselves with sticks. "My letter of recommendation," thundered D'Artagnan. "Give it to me, or by God I will run you all through like birds on a spit." Unfortunately, one thing made it impossible for him to carry out this. The sword he had been given had been broken in half during his first struggle. He had forgotten this, however, and therefore taken back when he tried to draw his sword and found himself armed only with a blunt stub 8 or 9 inches long, which the innkeeper had carefully put back into the sheath. The cook had furtively taken the rest of the blade, intending to use it as a larding pin. But this disappointment would probably not have stopped our fiery young man if the innkeeper had not suddenly realized that his guest's complaint was perfectly justified. "What could have happened to that letter?" he said, lowering his pike. "Yes, where is it?" cried D'Artagnan. "First of all, let me warn you that it is addressed to Monsieur de Tréville, and we have to find it. If we don't, he'll have it found, and you can count on that." This threat intimidated the innkeeper. After the king and the cardinal, Monsieur de Tréville was perhaps the man whose name was most often spoken by soldiers and even by civilians. There was Father Joseph, of course, but the terror aroused by the Great Eminence, as the cardinal's close associate was called, was so great that his name was mentioned only in a whisper. The innkeeper dropped his pike and ordered his wife and servants to do the same with their weapons. Then he set an example by beginning to look for the lost letter. "Is there something important in it?" he asked after several minutes of unsuccessful searching. "There certainly is," said D'Artagnan, who was counting on that letter to make his way at court. "It contains my fortune." "Bonds?" the innkeeper inquired anxiously. "Bonds on His Majesty's personal treasury," answered D'Artagnan. Since he expected to enter the king's service by means of that recommendation, he felt he could truthfully make this rather hazardous reply. "Good heavens!" the innkeeper exclaimed in despair. "But that doesn't matter," D'Artagnan continued with true Gascon self-assurance. "The money means nothing to me, and the letter means everything. I'd rather lose 1,000 pistoles than lose that letter." He could just have easily said 20,000, but he was restrained by a certain youthful modesty. All at once an idea flashed into the mind of the innkeeper, whose frenzied search had yet yielded nothing. "Your letter wasn't lost," he exclaimed. "What do you mean?" asked D'Artagnan. "It was stolen." "Stolen? Who?" "The gentleman who was here yesterday. He went into the kitchen while your doublet was there, and he stayed there alone. I'm willing to bet that he stole your letter." "You think so?" said D'Artagnan, unconvinced. Knowing that the letter was important only to him personally, he saw no reason for anyone to take it. None of the servants or guests had anything to gain by it. "You really suspect that insolent gentleman?" "I'm sure he's the one who did it. He seemed very upset when I told him you were under Monsieur de Tréville's protection, and even had a letter for him. He asked me where the letter was, and immediately went down to the kitchen, knowing your doublet was there." "Then he is a thief," said D'Artagnan. "I'll complain to Monsieur de Tréville, and he'll complain to the king." He majestically took 2 écus from his pocket and gave them to the innkeeper, who accompanied him to the door, hat in hand. He mounted his yellow horse and rode without further incident to the Porte Saint-Antoine in Paris. There he sold the horse for 3 écus, which was a good price, considering that he had pressed him hard during the last stage of his journey. The dealer admitted that he had paid an exorbitant sum only because of the horse had such an unusual color. D'Artagnan therefore entered Paris on foot, carrying his belongings under his arm, and walked till he found a room for rent that suited his meager means. It was an attic room on the Rue des Fossoyeurs, near the Luxembourg. After paying a deposit, he took possession of his room and spent a good part of the day sewing trimmings on his doublet and breeches. His mother had taken the trimmings from a nearly new doublet belonging to his father and given them to him in secret. He then went on to the Quai de la Ferraille to have a new blade put on his sword. Next he went to the Louvre, stopped at the first musketeer he asked, and asked him where Monsieur de Treville's house was, and he learned that it was on the Rue de Vieux Colombier, which was near the room D'Artagnan had rented. He took this as a favorable omen. Finally, satisfied with himself for the way he had behaved at Meung, without remorse for the past, confident in the present, and full of hope for the future, he went to bed and slept the sleep of the brave. In his case, it was also the sleep of the provincial. It lasted till 9 o'clock, when he got up and prepared to visit the famous Monsieur de Treville, who, in his father's opinion, was the third most powerful man in the kingdom. That was chapter 1.